Okay, Chapter 3. Thank you, Simon and Schuster Publishing, for allowing teachers to read aloud your books. Running Out of Time by Margaret Peterson Haddix. Chapter 3. Mr. Smythe had asked the question twice, and Jessie still hadn't heard it. "The presidents," Mary Ruddle hissed. "Recite the presidents." Jessie nodded gratefully and stood up. "George Washington," she began, "elected in 1789 and served 2 terms. Father of our country, led the military in the Revolutionary War." She zipped through the rest. Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, J.Q. Adams, Jackson, and the current President Van Buren, without thinking about them. Sometimes she liked to mention extra details, like her father's admiration for Andrew Jackson, even though it got her in trouble. But this time she did the list straight. She didn't understand why others, especially Hannah, thought the recitation difficult. Portraits of George Washington and Martin Van Buren hung on the wall over Mr. Smythe's desk, so it would be impossible to forget either of them. There weren't that many presidents in between. Hannah's problem was that she spent too much time craning her neck to see into the mirror that hung beside the 8th graders' desks. Jessie had never understood what it was doing there, unless Mr. Smythe wanted to torture vain students like Hannah. "And the next presidential election," Mr. Smythe prompted. "This year, November 1840, Jessie said automatically. Mr. Smythe always wanted his students to say what year it was. Jessie thought it was strange. Didn't everybody know? "Good," Mr. Smythe said, and turned his attention to 3rd grade reading. Jessie waited until he wasn't looking and made a face. She didn't like Mr. Smythe. He had hairs growing out of his nose and a way of looking at students as though he knew something that they didn't. Jessie couldn't believe he knew as much as the students, because he always had to check their work with his books. Just the day before, he'd forgotten the year that Miles Clifton came up from Kentucky to found the village. And he threatened to get out the whip when the 6th graders tried to tell him the right answer. "Did anyone ask you?" he'd screamed. And when all the other students looked up to watch him yell, he began fuming. "Am I talking to you? Everyone has to stay after school." Jessie hoped he wouldn't make them stay late today. She sat down and saw that her friend Mary had written, "What's wrong?" on her slate. "Nothing, just daydreaming," Jessie wrote back. But then she felt bad about not letting her best friend in on something. "Did you see Sally and Betsy are sick too?" she wrote. Mary grimaced and nodded. Jessie looked around to count the empty benches. 9 pupils were missing between Katie's 1st grade row and the 7th and 8th grade row, where Jessie, Hannah, Mary Chester Seward, and Richard Dunlap sat. "Back row. Are you doing your spelling words?" Mr. Smythe asked. "Yes, Mr. Smythe," Hannah said. She was the only one, since Chester and Richard were drawing dirty pictures. Jessie bent over her slate and wrote "Independence" 5 times. She couldn't wait for school to get out. But when Mr. Smythe finally dismissed everyone, Jessie held herself back from the rush for the door. "Want to come home with me? Pa gave me some extra clay," Mary said. Her father was a potter, and when he was feeling generous, he let his children play in his workshop. He once helped Mary and Jessie make a clay doll for Jessie's sister Katie. "No thanks, I've got to pick some herbs for Ma," Jessie remembered to say. She was walking out behind Mary when she noticed Katie still sitting in the front row. "My insides don't feel good," Katie said. Jessie stooped beside her and felt her sister's forehead, as she had seen Ma do with sick people. Katie's face was burning up, but the little girl shivered so hard, her teeth chattered. "What hurts?" Jessie asked gently. Katie pointed to her throat. She looked like she was going to cry, but she sneezed instead. "Here." Jessie handed Katie her handkerchief. Katie blew her nose, loud for such a little girl, and began coughing. "Can you walk home?" Jessie asked Katie. "No," Katie whispered, her eyes filled with tears. Jessie rubbed Katie's eyes with the handkerchief's clean end. "That's all right. I'll carry you, just like when you were really little." Crying, Katie climbed onto Jessie's back. It was awkward to carry Katie with both their lunch pails and all their books. Jessie wished Mr. Smythe were a nicer man and would come help them, but he was watching poor Caleb Benton erase the blackboards, as if waiting for Caleb to make a mistake. "Don't worry, you'll be okay," Jessie said softly, so Mr. Smythe couldn't hear her. She didn't want to be punished. "Okay" was a bad word. No one is supposed to say it, but Jessie liked it. Sometimes she wondered if it was forbidden because it had a secret power to make things okay. If that was true, Jessie wanted that power now. She wasn't sure Katie would be okay. Betsy Benton had said she had a sore throat yesterday too, and now she was so sick, even Mom was worried. Comfortable? Jessie asked as she walked unevenly out the schoolhouse door. Katie just sniffled, her face buried in Jessie's hair. You'll be okay, Jessie repeated so quietly that maybe even Katie didn't hear. She didn't answer, only moaned when Jessie stumbled and jolted her. As they lurched past the Webster's house, Jessie saw there were no quarantine signs on the door. Was that good or was that bad? Although she stumbled a few more times, Jessie finally made it to the door of the Kaiser cabin. Hello, Ma? She called. No one was home. Jessie's brothers were all out in the forge helping Pa, and Jessie remembered that Hannah had planned to stop off at Seward's store and look at some fabric she wanted, but would never be able to afford. Ma must be at one of the neighbors, which is strange. Usually at this time of day, Ma was in the cabin fixing supper. The fire was banked on the Dutch oven full of some kind of food, but there was no sign that Ma had been in the cabin since morning. Here, we'll get you to bed, then you'll be fine. Doesn't that feel better? Katie's face was almost as pale as her bedding. Thirsty, she murmured. Jessie got her a drink and waited for Katie to fall asleep. It didn't seem right to leave Katie, but Ma had acted like it was important to meet her in the woods. Jessie stopped at Pa's blacksmith shop on her way. Can you tell Ma that Katie's sick? Jessie asked Andrew, who was sorting scrap metal while Pa worked at the forge. Why can't you? Andrew was Jessie's favorite brother, but he could be a horrible pain. Mom wanted me to pick some herbs, and I don't want to go in the dark, Jessie explained. Chicken, Andrew taunted. Of course not. I just want to be able to see. Andrew shrugged, which Jessie took to mean that he would tell Ma about Katie. He waited until she had walked down the road before he yelled at her, Sure you're not going out to meet some boy? Shut up, Jessie shouted. Then she ran, hoping Pa hadn't heard her. Shut up was like okay, another bad word no one was allowed to use. They were even worse than taking the Lord's name in vain. Jessie could never understand why. She could see that God might be offended at being used as a common curse, something she'd heard only a few men do when they appeared very, very mad. But even though Jessie pretended okay had special powers, she knew it wasn't black magic or anything. And shut up was maybe a little rude, but Jessie knew it was no use trying to figure it out. This was just another secret. So why do you think okay is not allowed to be used? Jessie stopped running only when she reached the woods. With all the branches blocking the sun, it was always a little dusky and hard to see in there. She knew from school that the woods went on and on clear to the Mississippi River, with only a few settlements like Clifton carved out in their midst. She kind of liked that, even though she'd heard some grown-ups talk about being afraid of the woods. She guessed it was because there were still dangerous Indians about when they came out from the east, but the Indians had all moved farther west now. All right, why is the author choosing to use the term Indians? Is that culturally appropriate? Is that what should be used? So let's think about that. Jessie remembered the stories about the battles of fallen timbers and Tippecanoe and shivered. It didn't seem fair. The Indians had been here first, but Mr. Smythe had threatened to spank her for saying that in school. Jessie sat down on a log, thinking it would never be truly dark. Since she was here, she might as well pick herbs. She turned around to pull bark from a witch hazel tree, and then Ma was standing beside her. You shouldn't let people sneak up on you like that, Ma said. It seemed like a joke, but Ma's voice held an edge. It's just you, Ma, Jessie said. She waited for Ma to smile, but Ma didn't. Where were you? What's the dangerous thing I have to do? Is Katie... Shh! Ma looked around guardedly and then placed her lamp and medicine bag on the ground. She bent beside the rock as she had the night before. Jessie moved into the same pose. I think we're safe, but we'll have to whisper. I'll answer all your questions, but it's going to take a while. I did see Katie. Does she have the same sickness as Sally and Betsy? Ma looked away, as though she was too sad to look at Jessie. I'm afraid she does. It's a disease called diphtheria. It scared Jessie that Ma sounded so solemn. Jessie thought about her tow-headed little sister, who was only 6, but always tried to do what the big girls did. Is she going to be all right? Jessie asked. Are Sally and Betsy and the others? That depends. I have a lot to tell you, Ma said. Ma stopped. A strong wind rustled the leaves of all the trees around them. Jessie shuddered, but maybe that wasn't just because of the wind. I never wanted to tell you like this. Jessie, I just don't know how you're going to react. To what? Jessie asked impatiently. Ma's voice frightened her. Ma held her finger to her lips. Be still a minute. I'm trying to think. How do I tell you after all these years? It's just so complicated. Jessie waited, not used to seeing Ma so puzzled and worried, and finally Ma looked back at Jessie. We've been in Clifton for what, 12 years now? Right? Remember how Pa always told you we came here because there was more opportunity than back in Pennsylvania? Jessie nodded. Well, that's true, but not in the way he led you to believe. Clifton isn't an ordinary village. It's a historical preserve. What's that? Jessie's voice shook a little. Ma's gaze was steady. Here, everything is like it is in the 1800s, Ma said slowly. But outside, Ma seemed to be counting in her mind. Outside, it's actually 1996. Dun dun dun! That's the end of the chapter. It's actually 1996. So, by the way, this book was written in 1995. Okay. So, what genre is it? Okay. It's actually realistic fiction, even though, because it was set in 1996, there's going to be a lot of things that seem historical to you, and but the book was actually written to be realistic fiction. Okay, but some of the details. Now I can show you the cover. See, that's a phone, a payphone that she's talking into, and that's why I couldn't show you the cover, because I wanted you to think that it was actually 1800s when we started reading it. So that's chapter 3. Stay tuned for the next chapter. Bye.